I should point out that the 30 years of failure are not all mine. I'm sure other people have failed, and that's probably what we're going to talk about over the next hour or so. Oh, it is bright, he's right. Do I need to waggle these up a little? Do I need that? I don't. Oh, I'm all right. I'll be all right. I'll suffer with a migraine. Have to suffer for my art. That's better. Now I can hear myself, which is probably a bad thing. Good evening. Thanks very much for coming out. Well, you could be sat in a nice warm park in London with a salad or something, but thanks very much for coming. I'm here to talk about 30 years of failure, success, whatever else you like to call it, fame, infamy. Next year is 30 years since 1987. In 1987, I found myself in the House of Lords being acquitted on appeal on all charges to do with computer hacking, and that's really what I want to talk about over the next sort of 50 minutes or so. I was looking at a YouTube video the other day about how to do public speaking from a world-leading public speaking expert, and I've already failed with the lessons, because apparently, first of all, you're supposed to do lots of open hands, because apparently if you look at your hands, then you look at them open, you prefer your hands open, so I'm supposed to be showing you lots of open hands, so if I forget, I apologise. And then in passing, he said, whatever you do, if you do happen to be speaking on a lectern, golden rule, absolutely never, ever, ever touch the lectern, and I've already touched the lectern, so I do apologise. If anybody's making a note and ticking boxes of how many times I touched the lectern, we're up to about 2 now, and I do apologise for that. My name is Robert Schifreen, as Adrian said, and if you've ever studied computer crime in the UK, if you're young enough to have done A-level computer crime and things, then an A-level in IT security and computing, whatever, you might have mentioned you might have heard about my case. I was a hacker back in the 1980s. The world's first, I've done it again, I don't care. I'm going to touch the lectern. I apologise in advance. I'm going to touch the lectern. I can do it, but I can still do the open hands as well. I was part of a hacking crowd back in the 1980s. In the days when computer hacking wasn't really illegal, and we made a big point of that because we said, well, you know, if we get caught, so what? It's not really illegal. And I'm going to talk about what I was doing, what my group was doing, and specifically what we were doing 30 years ago. As I said, I was acquitted in 87, I was arrested in 85. So this, where we are, 2016, is bang in the middle of the 30th anniversary of me being arrested. 26th of March, I think it was, 1985, along with a fellow hacker from North of England up in Sheffield called Steve Gold, who sadly died a year or two ago. So I'm the one left. And we were arrested for hacking, as I said, and I'll talk about that. And I'll talk about what industry has learned in those 30 years and the mistakes that people made that allowed hackers like myself to get into their systems, and in some cases, what we've actually learned and how we've stopped making those mistakes. But in an awful lot, a depressingly lot of instances, what we actually haven't learned and why we are still allowing hackers into our system, and we're still relying too much on technology and not really stepping back and thinking, well, this is a brilliant idea, but let's just think about the security angle. And we're seeing that now with the Internet of Things, with the IoT, where marketing people are saying, we need the first talking fridge out, we need the first intelligent button to stick on the toilet wall, so when you're out of paper you can press the button and Amazon will deliver some more. Probably not in time for that current session, but maybe for the next one if you're lucky. And they do these things, and then the marketing want these things out straight away, and then at some point they start thinking to themselves, well, actually, maybe we should have thought about security as well. I was reading the news on my phone upstairs in my room not half an hour ago, and a number of US toy companies, Mattel and others, have been fined about $500,000 only today for holding information in databases about children that they shouldn't have done. You may wonder, many years ago when I used to download one of the Zone Alarm, which was a free firewall, and probably still is if you need it. And there are other things as well. I think Facebook as well. Facebook, they say you can't sign up unless you're 13. Zone Alarm, the thing I remember about Zone Alarm is it said you're not allowed to download this unless you're over 13. And I'm sure there were, at the time, an awful lot of 12-year-olds thinking the adults are really unfair not letting me download a firewall. I hate them all. The reason being is that legislation in the US says you can't put together a database of information about children under 13. You can have endless databases about people over 13, that's fine, and what they get up to and what they buy and what they do, but you can't have it for kids under 13. And that's why lots of places like Facebook won't let under 13 subscribe, because then you end up with a database about children and you're not allowed to have that without parents' consent. And people like Mattel were doing tracking cookies and all sorts of things like that on their website to track what under 13s were doing, and the law people said you can't do that, and they all got fined. So let's start with security 30 years ago, 1986. I was arrested, as I said, in 85, and by that time I'd been convicted. By the end of about 85, I had been convicted. I won my appeal in 87, so this time 30 years ago in 1986, it wasn't just the case that we weren't quite sure if hacking was illegal or not. In 1986, computer hacking was illegal. The court had said so, the Crown Court, Southwark Crown Court had said so. That was due to change in 87, but in 86 it had changed, and it was officially illegal, and I'll talk about why in a moment. As to what I was doing in that sort of time, I was working for a company called EMAP, which everyone thinks used to stand for East Midlands Allied Press, and as people from EMAP used to go around saying, it was actually East Midland Allied Press, and I have no idea what Midland meant, but there you go. And they published lots of computer magazines, and in the days when people got information about computers from these things called magazines, which meant if you wanted to find out something, you had to stand in Smith's, looking at the magazines on the shelf and thumbing through them to read all the latest information. Then you could go home and, obviously not having bought the magazine, and then you could go home and digest the information. Nowadays, of course, the internet has killed an awful lot of computer magazines. I used to work for a year or two on Personal Computer World, PCW. Had a great time there as a writer on that magazine, and again, that closed a couple of years ago. And sadly, one of its best-known columnist, Guy Cunley, also died a few years ago as well, so all seem to be dropping. My first job in 1983 was at EMAP with a magazine called Computer and Video Games, CMVG, which transitioned to a website after a few years and then finally died again a few years ago. God, this is getting depressing. But I worked in the days when Computer and Video Games, CMVG, was a printed magazine. I worked on that, and if anybody read that back in the 80s, and there was a column in that magazine called Bug Hunter, I was the bug hunter. And when I wasn't being the bug hunter looking for bugs in software, I was answering the phone to people like yourselves who says, I've just typed in this enormous Spectrum listing into my Commodore 64 and it won't run. Can you offer me any advice? Or I would try to work out why, when we printed a listing out of silver foil Sinclair ZX Spectrum printer, and we managed to transpose it into the magazine and print it entirely wrongly because half the symbols didn't come out. And that was my job. But when I wasn't working on the magazine, I was reading about this thing that was going to start up called Micronet 800. Every year since about 1979, everyone said, this is going to be the year of the modem. After about 1985, it became, this is going to be the year of Linux on the desktop. I like you, whoever you are. I can't quite see you, but I do appreciate the laughs. Neither of those two things actually quite happened, and they sort of fluttered away, but we had this, it's going to be the year of the modem. And so Micronet 800 was going to be born, and this was going to be the world's first sort of online computer magazine. And if you don't know Prestel and you don't know Micronet 800, Prestel was, if you know CFAX and Oracle and Teletext and these view data systems, Prestel back in the 80s was a dial-up, paid-for version of that. So you had your modem, or you had your acoustic coupler, or as Steve Gold always used to call it, your agnostic complicator, and you would dial up your number on the phone, and you would dial up Prestel. You'd wait for little beeps, and you'd put the receiver of the phone into its little cradle, and then you'd wait for your connection to Prestel, and you could start looking at all these various pages of information. And Prestel had about 50,000 users. Farmers used to use it for looking at the price of pigs that day. Travel agents used it an awful lot. You know when travel agents were using Prestel because they all wrote their passwords on a post-it note and stuck on the side of the monitor. So if anybody ever wanted to try looking at Prestel and you didn't have an account, you just go down to the high street and you find the nearest travel agent and you look on the side of the monitor and it says Prestel password, and there it was. So yes, that's one of those things that hasn't changed an awful lot in the last 3 decades. But I was reading about this thing called Micronet 800. Somebody, again, I was talking about the IoT things where people get the product out and then only later think about perhaps we should do security. Prestel had 50,000 farmers and travel agents and people like that using their system, and share brokers and things looking up share prices and stock prices. And then somebody had said, I know, let's have this thing called Micronet 800, so called because it started on page 800 of Prestel. Let's open it up to computer users. Let's let Commodore 64 and BBC Micro and Sinclair Spectrum users use our network of 14 big GEC mainframe computers. And they did. I should put that away right before while it's beeping. Oh, it doesn't matter. And nobody stopped to think about the security of that. Actually, they did, and they thought, it'll be fine. We can allow Sinclair and Commodore and BBC people to use our mainframes. They won't bother wanting to hack it. They're not into computers, really. And then it turned out they were. Excuse me while I put my phone on silent, because I had no idea I was going to be so popular tonight. It never does that. I don't even need vibrating. Is it you? Oh, I bloody put my Twitter thing on there, didn't I? That's what it is. Thank you for DDoSing me. I didn't realise I'd done that. I thought, what's my phone going off like mad for? That'll be it. Right. Nick, we definitely want a clock at the back, then I can turn my phone off for next year. So there I was reading about Prestel and Micronet 800 and thinking, this sounds great fun. Wouldn't it be nice to get an account on Prestel and have this modem and all this sort of stuff? And this was in the days when, at least when you dialed up Prestel and the Prestel computers answered, and when they answered and your modem started beeping and you put your handset in the receiver. When I was at school, they didn't even have auto-answer modems. So when I was at school and we had our terminal to the mainframe computer, and you wanted to connect from our terminal to in Edgware in North London to the mainframe in Hendon Town Hall, you dialed up on the phone and a person answered and you said, hello, this is Edgware School, can we have a line please? When they said yes, you pressed the little button. You had to be your own auto-answer modem. Then probably the unions got hold of it and decided, well, we can outsource this to a modem and let it answer the calls itself. And I did have one incident. If anybody knows me, and you've known me for about 25, 30 years, you've probably never heard me swear. And the reason I never swear is because one of the times when I picked up, apart from saying bloody Twitter, that's about as far as it goes. One time I picked up the phone to say, hello, this is Edgware School, can we have a line please? And then a certain other person in my class who ends up doing 14 years for armed robbery picked up the phone and swore all sorts of obscenities down the phone at Hendon Town Hall and got himself into awful trouble. And I got called out from class by the deputy head and had to repeat in front of the deputy head exactly what he'd said. And I was about 14 at the time, and that sort of puts you off swearing for an awful lot of time. So there was this thing called Prestel and Micronet happening, and I thought I'd love to join this. Then it turns out that EMAP, the company I worked for, actually were a big stakeholder in Prestel and Micronet, or Micronet certainly, and they were based in our basement. So I popped down to the basement, past the floor that ran Just 17 magazine, which if you are of a certain age, you'll remember Just 17 magazine, which was fab, because we used to get boxes of magazines in, and of course it was aimed at sort of 15-year-old girls. So we had motorcycle news on one floor, we had Just 17 on another, and we had computer and video games on another, and then EMAP down below. It was like some mad geek magazine person's nature of heaven, I think. And so I'd probably whiz in the lift past MCN, Motorcycle News, because I wasn't into bikes. Read the problem pages on Just 17 on the way down, because that issue used to come out all the time, and they were great. And then down to Micronet, and I was befriending these people from Micronet, and they said, oh yes, have an account, have a modem, have a play with it. This is going to be the year of the modem, it's going to be fab. And I would go up to Micronet's offices and sit next to Melanie, who used to eat Marmite out of a jar with a spoon. Don't know what happened to her. She probably died of salt overdose, but there you go. Lovely girl, but she did love her Marmite out of a jar with a spoon. And So I got into these modems and got into Micronet, and I started doing some writing for Prestel. And for Micronet, I was writing stories for Micronet about Sinclairs and Commodores and BBCs and stuff, and writing some pages onto the Prestel system. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Adrian was saying that you lot managed to drink till 5:30 last year. I tended to work at Micronet's offices quite late because their editor lived on a boat in Poplar Dock. And if you weren't home by 7 o'clock, you couldn't get in to get onto your boat. So he mostly slept in the office. And he was a wonderful guy called David, and he was very, very nice. He had one rule about when you're writing for Micronet, you can't write in green. You can't use green backgrounds because he doesn't like green. We did always point out to him that actually he's colourblind. He didn't know what green looked like. But he still had this rule saying, I don't know what green looks like, but whatever it looks like, you can't write in that. So we didn't. And I was writing a story for Micronet one day, and one of the things I was doing was reviewing this modem. New modem for the BBC Micro, I think it was. So I dialed up the Prestel system on this, look, open hands, I'm doing it now. So I dialed up this Prestel mainframe from my BBC modem that I was testing. It said, hello, welcome to Prestel, please log in, please type in your system, please type in your user ID, and I just tapped a key because I was just testing the modem. I happened to tap the number 2 key 10 times, and it said, thank you very much, now what's your password? So I'd found a valid user ID, and it was 10 number 2s. Going back to this Amazon toilet roll thing again, I guess. And one of the things that we've learned over the last 30 years, one of the few things we've learned over the last 30 years, is you never ask for people's usernames and passwords separately, and you ask for them all at once, and then they're either both right or they're both wrong. You never say to somebody, the username's right, now what's your password? Or you never say, the username was wrong, keep going around getting your username right, then I'll ask you for your password. But in 30 years ago, we used to do that. So Prestel was saying to me, that's correct username, what's your password? And Prestel passwords were 4 characters, and I'd done 10 twos, so I did 4 twos. Wrong. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, correct, good evening. Welcome to Prestel. Good morning, welcome to Prestel, because it was about 2:45 by that time. And I was now logged in as somebody called Mr. G. Reynolds, who worked for Prestel, and who had a test account whose username was 10 twos and password was 1, 2, 3, 4. Put that on the list of things we haven't really learnt an awful lot more about in the last 30 years. Very few people nowadays have passwords of 1, 2, 3, 4 because we've got a lot more complicated, and you'll find out now that the top password, the most common password, is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So mathematically, of course, that's probably thousands and thousands of times more complicated than 1, 2, 3, 4, but it doesn't quite work like that. You can probably crack it in about 3/4 of a second on a modern graphics card. It's ironic that the people who go out buying lots of graphics cards nowadays don't buy them to do graphics on. They buy it because it's the cheapest way to buy an awful lot of computing power for not much money for cracking passwords. And you see people who are either cracking passwords or mining bitcoins, and they've got themselves a big box full of the latest graphics cards. It's ironic how things turn out. So there I was, logged into Prestel as Mr. G. Reynolds, and it was a test account. To cut a long story short, Mr. Reynolds, Mr. G. Reynolds, I never did find out what the G stood for, I can't remember now. Because he was a BT user, he had access to various pages on Prestel that nobody else had access to, including the phone numbers of all their test computers. So I dialed up some of these test computers, and it said, hello, welcome to the Prestel test computer, please log in. 2222, 1, 2, 3, 4, incorrect. Okay. It's obviously not as easy as that. Now, if there's one thing that hackers are, if there's one thing that hackers do, because I can't work out the correct adjective, but I can do the verb. If there's one thing that hackers do, they persevere. Perseverant? Obsessive. Obsessive will do. If there's one thing that hackers are, it's obsessive. So I dialed up the test computer every Friday evening at 6 o'clock, once a week, for 10 months. Never started before 6 o'clock, of course, because that's when it was cheap rate on the phone. Nowadays, you probably don't remember when, a lot of you don't remember, when you had to pay 3p a call to try hacking, and you had to know the phone number, and if you got the password wrong 3 times, it hung up on you, and you had to pay 3p for another call. Nowadays, you just program your war dialer and you point it at a range of IP addresses, and away it goes for a flat monthly hacking fee of whatever your ISP charge is. Back in the 80s, it wasn't so like that. So over 10 months, I dialed up a test computer, Friday night, 6 o'clock, just before dinner. I don't quite know what Robert does up in his room, but his phone bill's very big, my mum always used to say. And then sometimes she used to call me for health joke coming up, which always frequently gets a laugh, and it probably will in an audience like this. I'd be sat upstairs on my computer, and 6 o'clock, my mum will call me down for dinner, and I'd shout down, "I can't come now, I'm on the spectrum." Yeah, I probably was. Think about it. Whether that's why Sinclair called it that, I have no idea. Probably. So I was dialing up this test computer, and after 10 months, between February and October, I think it was, I dialed it up again. "Hello, welcome to Prestel test computer. Please log in. SMAN : 14 digits, SED : 14 digits, open hand." SMAN stood for System Manager, SED stood for System Editor, and somebody at Prestel was clearly out of Post-it notes that day because they put the System Manager and the System Editor credentials on the login screen. Continuing to cut this long story short, I logged in because it said please log in, which is interesting, of course, because when the Computer Misuse Act happened, you have to prove intent. And if you've got a login screen that says please log in, can't someone just stand up in court and say, "Well, I didn't intend to hack, you asked me to try"? And someone actually tried that, and that was great. It worked, yeah. And there was also a case many years ago. I think 3 guys worked for Dixon's, and they worked in the payroll department, and they programmed the system so that if they left or got sacked, the payroll system would carry on paying them. And they ended up in court under the Computer Misuse Act, and 2 of them pleaded guilty and got, I can't remember what it was, 18 months or something. And the third one said, "I didn't mean to hack, I was addicted to hacking. I did it for medical reasons, I couldn't stop myself," and he got off. And the other 2 were livid. So there I was, System Manager of Prestel's test mainframe. And if we've sort of learnt one thing in the last 30 years, it's that you don't use live data on test computers. Prestel did, because when you have these great big 4-foot disk packs, the easiest way to get some test data is you just copy it across to another 4-foot disk pack on this big washing machine-sized drive, and that's what you do. So that's what they did. So as system manager of the mainframe, I went to the system management pages, and you could read the password file in those days, and I said, "Okay, who's got an account on here? I'd quite like their password and their details, please." And for various reasons, probably because he was actually present at the launch, Prince Philip had an account on Prestel, HRH, the Duke of Edinburgh, husband of the current Queen and all that, for those from Portland, Oregon. And, where's Rebecca? I can't even see anything, but I spoke to her earlier. And I pulled up Prince Philip's user file, and it gave me his name, it gave me his address, which of course everyone knows is Buckingham Palace, but then it gave me his username and his password. So of course I logged on to that, and it said, "Good morning, HRH, the Duke of Edinburgh, welcome to Prestel." At which point I thought, oh, this is quite good, I'm a hacker now. And that's quite interesting because security people, security personnel, CISOs as they call themselves, CTOs and all that, think that people set out to become hackers. They think they do it for certain reasons. People used to think, oh yes, we're in certain lines of business, we sell arms, we're in the fur trade back then when it was big, we are big business, people want to hack us, whatever reason. People hack for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes for fame, sometimes for their 15 minutes of fame as I did, sometimes because they've got a grudge against the company, sometimes they don't even think they're going to be a hacker. And then 5 minutes later, they tap in the number 2 key 10 times, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and suddenly find themselves a hacker. And they think, this is quite fun. I've played the odd computer game on my Spectrum. Now my Spectrum is linked to £14 million worth of GEC mainframe computer, and this could be quite a good game. So the first thing I did is I nicked a little blue notebook from the stationery cupboard at work, and started writing down people's passwords. And I put in Prince Philip's, and I put in half the people I used to work with, because it seemed like the sort of thing you do while you can, and it was all jolly good fun. And then I spoke to somebody at Micronet who I knew, who I got to know when we got stuck in a lift, because in the 80s we had lifts with those big metal things that you pull across, and we didn't quite pull it far enough and the lift got stuck, so we were talking about things. And she said, you probably should tell Prestel that you've managed to hack their system and you're now system manager. And she phoned Prestel for me, and she said, I've got someone here, I won't go into detail, but he's just managed to hack your system and he's system manager. And they said, you can't do that. And she said, hang on a minute, I'll call you back. And she said, they don't believe it. And I said, well, Micronet is page 800. If you don't know about page numbers on Prestel, and you can be forgiven for not knowing about page numbers on Prestel, they're all hierarchical, they're all based in a tree. So you start with page 1, then you've got 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, up to 1, 9. And then under 1, 4, you've got 1, 4, 1, 1, 4, 2, 1, 4, 3, and so on. So page 800 is level 8, then 0, then 0. A bit like how the phone system works if you're into hacking phones and blue boxing and all that, which I never was. So the very, very first page on Preston, I think it's page 1 or page 0, which nobody apart from System Manager can edit, and it says main index. So we made it say main idnex. We swapped 2 characters around, IDNEX. Then we phoned Prestel back and said, go and have a look at your main index page, and they said, oh look, he's hacked Prestel, that's quite serious. And if you look what was going on back in the 80s, there were a few hackers about, and they were getting in the papers, and then no sooner were they done for hacking and doing minor little things, they got whizzed off to the US and got a big posh job in security in the States. So I thought, this could be quite good. So we'll phone Prestel and we'll tell them what I did and tell them who did it and all that sort of stuff, and I'll help them because I like to be quite nice. I didn't intend to be a hacker, blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately, Scotland Yard at that time had just set up a thing called the Computer Crime Unit, headed by a very nice, now retired detective inspector called John Austin. And Prestel phoned John Austin, and John Austin came and took away myself and the contents of my bedroom in 41 black plastic sacks and 3 Volvos. And I was charged with hacking. But you can't charge people with hacking back in 1985 because there was no law against it, as I said. So what the police decided to do was charge me with forgery. So in 1985, for a period in 1985 and 1986, I was a convicted forger. Forgery and Counterfeiting Act 1981 basically says you can't forge someone's signature on a cheque. And what the police tried to say is, well, if you type someone's password into a computer that isn't yours, the password, not the computer, actually both, while the password sits in memory for 3 milliseconds while the computer checks it, that's the same thing as having written a signature on a cheque, giving it to the girl behind the till in the bank, and her looking at it and saying that's right or that's not, for those who remember cheques. And the Crown Court said yes in front of a Crown Court judge, and I was convicted. That was 1985. 1986, went to appeal in the High Court in front of the Lord Chief Justice, and we said, hacking is a very naughty thing, but it's not forgery. And the appeal court in front of the Lord Chief Justice said, you're quite right, and threw out the convictions. And then because it was a test case, the prosecution can then appeal again. So it went to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords, who, funnily enough, you might think of old doddery men who know nothing about computers, absolutely nothing of the sort. They were really on top of it. And they said, you're quite right, forgery is not hacking, and they threw it all out. So, to cut a long story short, why do I keep saying that? Because I do too many long stories. To do yet another short story, we now have something in this country, in the UK, called the Computer Misuse Act of 1990, which came out a year or two after I was acquitted. So now we have some legislation which we can use as a deterrent against hackers to say, don't stay upstairs on the spectrum all night hacking away because now it's illegal and you'll get caught. And you're a very naughty boy. In those days, I could get away with it because nobody thought it was particularly illegal and it was all a bit of fun. So as a result of my getting off, we now have this thing called the Computer Misuse Act, which has, to a certain extent, changed the way security works in this country, but at the end of the day, it hasn't done a huge amount. There's been some cases and some high-profile cases, and I think you can get 5 years now under the CMA, but it hasn't had the impact possibly that people thought it might, partly because when you've got 500 million people being hit by a virus every day around the world, the police can't investigate every single one. Partly, even if they wanted to, they simply don't have the manpower or the expertise or the technical knowledge. They're too busy concentrating on the important things like child pornography and drugs and terrorism and so on, and every little minor crime where somebody steals a fiver from your bank, they simply don't have the resources to do anything about. BT had some consultancy back in the 80s saying, this is from the National Computing Centre in Manchester when it was there. I don't even know if it still is. And the NCC had said to them, did you know that if you open up Prestel, which is currently used by farmers and travel agents, to these strange people with Spectrums and Sinclairs and BBCs, you're probably going to get hacked and you need to beef up your security? And Prestel said, you're probably right. And then they did nothing about it. That came up in court, which is quite interesting because nowadays, when we go for the ethical hacking and the pen testing and we get the ethical hackers in, and when we get the consultants in, and when we get people in from FAST to make sure that we've got all our software licenses up to date, the one thing we always have to tell our senior managers is make sure that we are prepared, time-wise and finance-wise, to deal with any problems that arise from this report. But Prestel simply didn't do that, which is quite interesting. So by all means, get the ethical hackers and the pen testers in if you run a company, but if you're not going to have the resources to do anything about what they find out, you might as well not get them in. It's simply not worth the trouble, and it'll be even more hassle when you get hacked. The rumour is that when Prestel got hacked, and it was all over the news, I ended up on telly on a programme called Micro Live, for those who remembered Micro Live, and everyone thought I'd disguised my voice, because when I was on Micro Live telling Ian McNaught-Davis, he died as well. This is getting really bad. This is when you get to a certain age, just talk about the stories. Oh yeah, he was great, he died. Oh yeah, she was wonderful. Oh, she died as well. Anyway, so there I was on the telly telling Ian McNaught-Davis about how I'd managed to hack into Prestel. And everyone who watched it thought I'd disguised my voice deliberately, because I sounded very, very snotty and nasal. And I didn't disguise my voice at all. It's just that I just came out of hospital the day before, having had surgery on some polyps in my sinuses, so I didn't have to do the voice disguise at all. Although I think they did refer to me as, they gave me a false name of Mike, because I thought, we'll call myself Mike Ronette. Maybe I'm the lost member of the Ronettes. Mike Ronette. Anyway, the rumour is that when Prestel got hacked, and I was on the telly saying, Prestel's been hacked, blah, 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 Prestel wrote to every single subscriber and said, as part of our ongoing security, we're going to change all your passwords. They sent everyone a new password in an envelope, and that was that. The trouble is, if you are a publisher of information on Prestel rather than just a reader, you had two passwords. One was your reading password and one was your IP password, your information provider password. They never changed those. So any of the Uber hackers like myself could still get in, which was quite interesting. So again, if you're going to do security, do it properly or don't do it at all. The rumour is that Margaret Thatcher, then the PM, I'm not going to say what happened to Margaret Thatcher, I'm sure she's still alive somewhere. She phoned the head of BT and said, I do hope the rest of your security is not as bad as Prestel. And he said, of course, ma'am, it's absolutely fine, knowing full well that it wasn't. At the time, you could walk into a phone box. If you remember those things, they're dead, of course, as well. And you could walk into a phone box and you could type in *#65535#, and you would get £655 and 35 pence worth of credit, because that's how the engineers debugged phone boxes, until someone leaked it. And now they're probably dead as well. There's a theme developing here, isn't there? I do apologise. There is a rumour that if you work for BT and you get a severe telling off from someone senior in the company, you get a disciplinary form called a PP1, and PP stands for Prince Philip, after what Margaret Thatcher did to the head of BT back in the '85. And I was told that by somebody who knows, so it might well be true. So if you ever know anybody in BT and they say, I've just got a PP1 form, then they're in deep trouble. I never made any secret of what I was doing on the hacking side. You know, it wasn't illegal. It used to impress people. It used to impress girls when I was trying to chat up girls at school. You know, come home and see my modem and my huge collection of telly software. Worked every time. It's different now, of course. You know, people don't tend to talk about hacking so much nowadays. We've got groups like Anonymous who are quite shady. You know, who are Anonymous? Who are the members of Anonymous? Anybody really who wants to say, I'm a member of Anonymous, and you can't prove they are, you can't prove they aren't. And then they have other names as well. And then the latest name for the hacking group, as of today or as of yesterday, is the something bears. What's it called? I did write it down. The who? Fancy Bears, the Fancy Bears, which are a Russian hacking group. And what they've done, because Russia didn't like the fact that they got thrown out of the Olympics for cheating, they've now hacked into the World Anti-Doping Authority, WADA, and released all the files on the American athletes to prove that they were taking drugs as well, but they were taking it for legitimate reasons that had been passed because they had legitimate medical reasons and stuff. So we now have the Fancy Bears, which I think is a much better name than Anonymous. Don't know what they'll do next, we'll see. One of the things that Prestel relied on, and one of the things that we still rely on an awful lot, getting technical for a minute, is things like log files. We used them then an awful lot, we use them now, and it's the same. It's a great way of gathering evidence about what's happening on your systems is the log files. So make sure if you run systems that you have all those logs turned on, make sure your firewall is turned up to volume 11 for maximum logging, make sure all of your systems, all your web browsers, all your MSN chat clients, anything else that people are using, your Windows event log, there's a great little utility you can get for free from sysinternal, part of Microsoft now, called sysmon. And what that does is it adds a load more logging to Windows. So when lots of things that didn't previously get logged, they now get logged into the event log, and you can look and see what people are doing. The important thing about event logs and logs in general, move them somewhere safe as soon as you can. Because if somebody gets into your system, the first thing they'll do is they'll tinker with the logs. It was true then, it's true now. And even if they don't tinker with them, if a hacker can stand up in court and say, I could have tinkered with them if I wanted to, then that could possibly prove that that log file is now inadmissible in court as evidence. And again, that sort of thing's happened before. Back in the 80s, when I was fiddling with Prestel, they did log files and they did similar sort of things. When you logged into Prestel, if you got your password wrong 3 times, not only did it hang up the line on you and make you have to dial again and cost you another 3p or 5p if it was before 6 o'clock. It also sent an email to the security manager saying this account's been subject to 3 incorrect passwords. And so it therefore follows, allegedly, that if somebody was to get into the security manager's mailbox and delete their mail, end of log files, end of audit trails, end of security reports, track's perfectly covered. And yeah, that's what I did. So they didn't quite know they were being hacked. And even if they did know, there's nothing they can do about it because the hackers never started till after 6. And all the security staff had gone home by 5:30. And they never thought, well, the hackers, if they're going to do it, are going to start after 6 when it's cheap rate on the phone. But we're all going to go home by 5:30. And then they go home, and suddenly it gets hacked. And they come in the next morning, oh, everything's fine. Nothing in the logs, none of my emails saying failed passwords, everything must be fine. And we're all twiddling away on our modems of an evening, looking for all sorts of things and then covering our tracks. 30 years ago, we used to choose our targets carefully. We knew who we wanted to hack and why. We knew which accounts they had, where they are, which companies they were. And the first thing you then had to do is find out their phone number, which was normally going to be somewhere within the range of their normal voice phone numbers, but you would find their computer phone numbers, and you would dial them up and you would try to hack them, and you'd guess the phone number, then the username, and then the password. You had to choose your targets carefully and specifically because it was expensive. You couldn't just try a million numbers. Yes, people did this thing called war dialing, where you simply program your modem to dial up telephone numbers within a range. And once, for a complete laugh, I used to run a company, and for a complete laugh, I dialed the company registration number, which was an 8-digit number. I dialed it on the phone, and I got a modem, which I thought was very ironic. But nowadays, hackers don't have to choose their targets so carefully. They can just dial and try and ping millions and millions of IP addresses at random. Some will work, some won't. It's the same with spam. You don't have to look for legitimate email addresses to send spam. You just send everybody in the world an email from AAAAA@AAA.com to ZZZZZ@ZZZZZ.com and everything in between. Some will get through, some won't. Build yourself a database of email addresses. And of course, the ones that are legitimate, you'll know because you put a thing on the bottom saying, if you want to be taken off this spam list, please reply to this message. And of course, everyone reads it and they say, oh, I better reply to this message to be taken off the database. And as soon as you do that, the spammer knows, oh, I've got a valid address here. Thank you very much. I'll now start sending you more spam and I will flog your details to every seller of Viagra in the world. But nowadays, of course, we just simply try IP addresses at random, and you can get programs that will simply try systems and hack them. And what also happens a lot is that Microsoft puts out security patches for Windows, and they say, if you don't install this patch, a hacker can get in by doing blah. So all the hackers of the world think, oh, this is quite interesting. Let's go trawling IP addresses all around the world looking for people that haven't got this patch installed. And if they haven't, Microsoft have told us what we can do. So that's great fun. We didn't have security patches back in the 80s. We do now. They're enormous and they're ridiculous. So hackers nowadays can hack at random. And that's quite interesting because one of the things that people often say to me when they are looking for security advice is, who would want to hack me? You know, I'm a three-man engineering company in Slough. Who would want to hack us? And the answers are, people will simply hack you at random because they can program their system to do that. There's a company down on the south coast near me in Battle, named after the Battle of Hastings, or whether they actually held the battle in Battle because it was called Battle, I don't know. Anyway, there's a place down on the south coast near me called Battle, and there's a company there that makes that sells solar panels. And they were happily trading away, selling solar panels from their little place in Battle. Then one day their website was full of propaganda for ISIS, or probably so-called ISIS, as you have to say. I wonder at what point you can stop saying so-called. I wonder when we can probably say to ourselves, actually, I think they're probably called ISIS now, or IS. We don't have to say so-called. Anyway, one day, Battle solar panels, or whatever they were called, suddenly found their website full of ISIS propaganda. And it turned out that somebody purely at random had come across their website. It wasn't terribly well protected. They hadn't patched WordPress or whatever it was, and their website had been hacked. Nobody would have thought they'd be hacked. Nobody could quite understand it, and it was simply because they got hacked at random. What we didn't have back in the 80s was data breaches, which sounds like some posh computer trousers, really, doesn't it? But I'm going to put my data breeches on. I might go and invent data breaches and sell them on eBay. Anyway, we've all heard of things like Ashley Madison. We've heard of a Sony PlayStation network that lost 104 million accounts. Probably the most infamous data breach in this country from 5 or 10 years ago now, still sends shudders down the spine of people in Whitehall, was the child benefit records fiasco. Somebody in Newcastle, I think it was, where the child benefit office was, no, London. Somebody in London, where the child benefit system was, needed to send some child benefit records up to the office in Newcastle to be audited. So they dumped 7 million child benefit records, name, address, child's name, national insurance number, bank account details, of everybody in the country who gets child benefit, all 7 million records. They dumped it onto a couple of CDs, stuck it in the post to Newcastle, unencrypted, and it never got there. And to this day, they don't quite know where those CDs ended up. The first question you ask yourself is, why would any system be written that gives anybody permission to dump the database to 2 unencrypted CDs? But hey-ho, they did. Why did they send the entire database? Did they actually need the entire database for the audit? No, all they want is with a few names. But when they phoned their IT supplier and said, we don't want all 7 million records, can we just have a few, please? And they would said, yes, that'll be £2,000, please, to do the filter job. Because you know how IT suppliers treat their government clients. So the government said, oh, we'll just send the whole lot. Then what happened was, somebody put the CDs in the post tray, and the post tray said DHL on it. And they thought, oh, that's great, that's DHL, they're a courier, it's tracked, blah, blah, blah. It was DHL, but it wasn't the proper courier tracked service. It was just cheap internal post that DHL also happened to run. So it wasn't tracked, and they lost the CDs, which was great fun. I happened to be driving up, I think I was driving up to Scotland that day from London for some particular reason, and it just ended up, my mobile phone just never stopped. And so every 50 miles I was popping into the next local TV station to do an interview for whoever it was talking about this child benefit record. But if we relied on computers for our entertainment, and we were getting into them and for home computing and learning programming and stuff in the 80s, nowadays our reliance on technology is just crazy. We can sit on our mobile phones, we can use laptops wherever we happen to be, we can be on planes using mobiles, we can be sat in the audience here looking at a film when you're supposed to be listening to me, but I won't take offence. Don't worry, I'm not looking. But in those days, more and more people than you might think actually relied on computers. In 1987, when I got acquitted by the House of Lords, I got whisked away by Channel 4 News to do an interview. And you didn't have to stop looking at your phone, sorry. You can carry on. I got whisked away by Channel 4 News to do an interview. So I was sat in the ITN newsroom and waiting to go on air. And two interesting things happened when I was doing some big 9 o'clock news at 10 type interviews. One of which is that I was sat in the studio waiting to go on. Then the US invaded Libya, so they dropped my story. Priorities, I mean. And then secondly, I was sat in the ITN newsroom waiting to go on air on News at 10, and an announcement came over the tannoy, the computer system's gone down. Can anyone who's got a typewriter bring it to the newsroom now? Which is interesting, they relied on technology back then, and it just goes to show that sometimes when it goes down, if it's not backed up properly and you haven't got backup systems, things fail. And if it's the news at 10 on the telly that has to start at 10 o'clock and your computer system goes down, you're a bit stuffed. There was also a very famous case, talking of news systems, when I think it was Shimon Peres, the Israeli PM, who was doing a speech live at some big press conference on telly, and he was reading his auto cue, and someone hacked the auto cue and was changing his words live and making him say things he didn't mean to say, which was quite fun. What else is new this side of a 30-year barrier? Internet of Things, as I mentioned, you're going to be seeing cars hacked, and you're going to be able to play with cars and hack them later on this week, which is the way things are going. We always used to joke that things would have computers in back in those days. We joked that we would have wearable computers and things. Now, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, back in the 80s, wired up a coffee machine to the internet, so so the students could see how much coffee was left in the machine to see if it was worth actually getting out of their rooms and getting up from their sofa and daytime telly to go and get some coffee, and possibly even going to a lecture if they had some time after that. And we all thought it was silly and that it would never catch on. Now you can buy a Samsung fridge that runs Windows and has got God knows how many Pentium processors in it. And every time you take something out the fridge, you scan it, and again, it orders it for when you're out of it. And it tells you, you can talk to your fridge and say, how much cheese have I got in stock? And it'll tell you. I've seen internet kettles, all sorts of IoT stuff. I saw an internet kettle hacked the other week, which was quite fun, because you can hack into the internet kettle, and you can then have it automatic turn on and off about 40 times a second, which makes the switch catch fire. Because it doesn't expect anybody to do that. Unless you've got naughty kids who are fighting over whether you can have tea or not, and they keep turning the kettle on, you keep turning the kettle off, but you can't quite manage 40 times a second, but there you go. But now you've got Windows in fridges and God knows what else. I was thinking the other day, we've got Windows on fridges and passwords on Post-its, and I'm halfway to doing a new version of these are the few of my favourite things, but I'm not quite there yet. But Windows in fridges and passwords on Post-its is a start. Social media has happened in the last probably 10 years. And social media is interesting. Facebook has, 1 billion regular users. Twitter has about 400 million. And again, that's completely changed the way we live our lives. It's changed the way we are, who we want to be, who we perceive ourselves to be, who we want to pretend we are. And the big thing about social media, which is very interesting, and on the economic side of the internet, the thing about social media and the thing about an awful lot of the internet is that it's free. And the bits of the internet that aren't free, people still think should be free. And it's very hard to get people to pay for stuff on the internet. And the whole point about the internet being free has one interesting thing. on the hacking side and the security side. If you charge for something, you need to ask in advance for people's credit card numbers and their name and address. And therefore you can just about reliably prove who they are, a few fraudsters aside. Because everything's free, if I want to sign up on Twitter as Bill Gates or Noddy Holder or whoever else I want to be, I can do so. And until Twitter or Facebook find out my account of what I've done and close it down, I can be Bill Gates, I can be Noddy Holder, I can be a 14-year-old girl, I can be anybody I like. And if you've ever done the exercise of setting up a false social media profile as a 14, 15, 16-year-old girl and see the sort of abuse you get online, it's very, very scary. And if you're thinking of experimenting, be prepared, it's not fun. And it starts pretty quickly as well. Social media in the 1980s was a bit different. You know, social media then, when I was a hacker, meant me and about 6 or 7 other hackers trudged up on the tube from North London to the Chinese restaurants in Soho, and we sat around a large table eating huge amounts of lemon chicken and drinking large amounts of Diet Coke. And that was our social media. That's how we swapped passwords, that's how we exchanged stories, that's how we knew how to do things. Nowadays, it's anonymous and it's fancy bears, and they do it all online, and they do it all in dark web forums, and we've got the dark web, and we've got Tor and so on. These sort of things are hidden. In the 80s, it wasn't hidden because it wasn't illegal. And there was no huge motivation to do illegal things online in whatever form you want to talk about that being. The motivation, as I said, it was done for fun. People hacked for fun. It was a bit of fun. When people hacked copy protection on computer games back in the 80s, very rarely did they ever play the game after they'd hacked it. The fun was breaking the copy protection. The fun was saying, these programmers think they're cleverer than me, I can prove they're not. And to a certain extent that's changed, to a certain extent it hasn't. But you talk to people who were breaking copy protection on Spectrum and BBC games back in the 80s, they never played the game. They didn't want to, they didn't need to. The fun was breaking the protection. The fun was being a better programmer. I wrote something on these papers yesterday which hadn't crossed my mind until very recently. Something that we've got now that we never had, talking about the data breaches side of things. One word, Snowden. In the 80s, in the 70s, no one officially acknowledged that there was this thing called MI5 or MI6 or GCHQ. You know, that their existence was a national security issue. They got, you know, if you look on maps, they didn't exist. There was an empty field in Cheltenham where GCHQ was supposed to be, and as we later found out, where GCHQ actually was. Now we've got people like Snowden leaking secrets, which, was that the best thing to happen to security or the worst thing to happen to security? Depends who you talk to, but it's certainly a huge big thing in the world of online security and electronic commerce. If I said to you online banking, was online banking around in the 80s, you'd probably all say no. Online banking was around in the 80s. The first online banking in this country, the first mass market, large-scale online banking in this country was launched in 1983, 33 years ago. It was a joint venture between Nottingham Building Society and the Bank of Scotland, officially known as Bank of Scotland, brackets, not the Royal Bank of Scotland, close brackets, because people always get confused. And they had an office and a branch in Holborn in London, and you could do your Building Society account in the branch in Holborn, and you could also do it by a view data system on this little TAN data terminal that they gave you. Nobody ever thought of online crime then. Nobody ever stood back and think, what's this thing going to be about online bank crime? Is it going to be a problem? As it turns out, it was. Something that wasn't a problem in the 80s, passwords. How many passwords did people have in the 80s? 1, 2, 3. What have we got now? Hundreds. You've probably seen people say, well, if you've got hundreds of passwords, you need to go and download yourself a password vault program. How are we going? 5 or 10 minutes, that should do it. If that's all right, Nick. You need to go and download yourself a password vault program to store all your passwords. I'm here to tell you, you do not need a password vault. All you need is one of these, which you can buy on the internet on Amazon for about £7. And if you can't read the title, it says, The Personal Internet Address and Password Logbook. And people actually buy these off Amazon. It's a proper nice ring binder, little book, and it's got lots of pages with tabs from A to Z, name, address, login, stroke username, password, notes. 3 per page. You can store all your passwords. Who wouldn't want one of those? And then at the back, once you've done that, you've got a space for all your software license numbers and your license keys, home network settings, administration URL, Wi-Fi username and password, router, admin username and password and address. All the useful information you could ever want at your fingertips. So that's how we do password vaults nowadays. In the 80s, of course, we probably wrote them down securely on post-it notes on the side of monitors. Now we have a little thing called the Internet Address and Password Logbook. So that's progress for you. Let me whiz through a few last points and then we'll wind up and then we'll probably have some questions and then somebody else might want to go on or we might want to do a film or something. A few more things. Email. Email in the 1980s, there were lots of different computer systems. There was Prestel, there was Telecom Gold, there were 4 or 5 other things. They didn't talk to each other. So if you wanted to email somebody on Prestel, you needed a Prestel account. If you wanted to email somebody who was on Telecom Gold, you also needed a Telecom Gold account, and so on. Lots of accounts. So we all had lots of accounts. We probably didn't have that many passwords, but we had lots of accounts. I'll talk about a couple more things, and then we'll probably wind up. Yes, we are nearly winding up, actually. That's all right. I can go on for days about this. I do apologise. Storage capacity. When I started computing in 1980 at school, we had a Research Machines 380Z computer, big black box running CPM. It was brilliant. And floppy disks, 5¼ inches, 72K per side. So by the time you've used 40K to load the operating system, you had about 25, 30K for your programs. 72K per side. Now I can walk into a computer shop and I can buy a 1 terabyte external drive that holds a terabyte of information. And if you work on about 5K per page, which is what the printing industry does when they tell you how much ink your printer's going to use and how little it's going to cost to run, oh yes. If you work on that, a 1 terabyte drive will hold a stack of paper 3 miles high, which is actually quite easy to work out because a ream of paper that's 500 sheets on 80 GSM is exactly 2 inches thick, 6 to a foot, and then you can work it out. So you can walk out with a stack of paper 3 miles high. So when you watch all these programs on satellite telly about passport control and the customs and nothing to declare UK, nothing to declare Canada, nothing to declare USA, nothing to declare Australia. Who says television isn't varied nowadays? And you see these people with 50,000 quid's worth of heroin up their bottom. You can now store tens of millions of pounds worth of somebody else's data on something the size that would probably go in your bottom. But the brilliant thing is, let me say where this is going, because we now have extra strong data encryption, you don't even have to do that because they can't read it anyway when they find it. So you can just keep it in your pocket. How clever is technology? You can even keep your data in your pocket and not putting it anywhere else where the sun doesn't shine. Don't worry, there was nothing funny while you were out. I left all the good bits for now. And of course, you have these duress passwords, and you have very clever little encryption that you have two decryption keys and 2 passwords. So if somebody's saying to you, I work for customs, please type in the decryption password, you type in 1 password, and up comes all these pictures of little fluffy kittens. And then when you get home, you type in the real decryption password, and up comes all the data you stole from a local bank. And that's technology, that's progress, maybe. One more thing, honestly. SQL injections and buffer overruns. Back in the 1980s, back in the 1970s, things like buffer overruns on programs under Unix and big mainframes were causing system problems then. It's still happening. 20, 30 years ago, people were hacking into database using SQL injection attacks. They're still doing it. And you think, if the world can eradicate polio and smallpox, can we not stop people doing SQL injections? Can we not say to the world, please go and sanitize your input before you pass it to a database query? You know, it's not as difficult as polio and smallpox. Well, clearly it is, which is a sad thing. And what I really want to leave you with, finally they say, what I really want to leave you with is that if there's one thing that hasn't changed in the last 30 years, it's awareness of IT security. It's just how important it is. If it was important then, it's hugely more important now. And whereas we are quite aware of security, which is why we're here and why some of us actually paid for a ticket to come here, we are aware of security and we know the implications of not taking it seriously. And there are so many people out there who don't. I had an email from somebody where I used to work saying, our shared drive has suddenly gone a bit strange and I can't quite read all my files and they're all full of rubbish, and there's another file appeared in my directory. You can tell my age because I call it directories and not folders. There's a file appeared in my directory called decryption info. Do you think this could be a problem? And this had gone to the help desk of a large company with 5,500 staff, and the help desk had said, oh, I don't know. And then it had gone to somebody else in the other technical desk, and they said, oh, I don't quite know what this is. And I'll send it on to Robert. He's a bit techie. He might know. So I looked at it, they sent it on to me, and they said, you don't think this could be a security issue, do you? And I said, well, if you've suddenly got all these strange files in your directory and it says decryptioninfo.txt on one of the files, it's probably ransomware. You've probably been hit by ransomware. And they said one of those words that I don't say since I had to repeat them all at 14 to the deputy head, and they went away and tried to sort it out. And thankfully, because I'd done a proper backup strategy, they managed to get everything back. And people just don't have this awareness. So what I'm involved in now, if anybody wants to know, is I run a thing called Security Smart, and we send out security awareness training to companies by email. So all your staff get these weekly emails saying, here's how to take security seriously, here's the topic of the day, here's a multiple choice question to make sure you've understood it, and there's a dashboard that you as managers can log into to see if people have got their questions right. So I'm trying to educate people in how to take security seriously. And the more of us do that, be it myself, be it all of you, the more we can go out and spread the message saying, take security seriously. We can talk about it, we can have a bit of fun, we can be up drinking, talking about it till 5:30 in the morning. Good luck to anybody who does. But the more we can take security seriously, the more we can spread that message. Maybe if I'm here in another 30 years, when I'm 82, maybe people will finally have got the message. We might even have eradicated SQL injection attacks. Thank you very much.